you are going to learn how to become a leader at work. This is a 3-part series of conversations that I've been having with author Alan Weiner. He has a new book out called the Highflier Handbook. His book is all about how to help you become seen as a leader and eventually become a leader yourself. Now, a little background before we jump into part 1. I have known Alan literally since the previous century. He is the first person to give me an opportunity when I moved to Los Angeles to become a consultant. I worked at his consulting firm as an intern, and he brought me around to all the companies, taught me how to do workshops, and I've been doing it ever since. We've been in communication ever since, and we're good friends. We talk and text all the time, and I'm thrilled to be able to support the launch of his new book. So let's jump into this first conversation. Welcome, Alan. My first question that I'm going to pitch right to you is, what's the most common question you get at your firm?
For sure, it's how could we develop more executive presence in all of the people who work here? Certainly the senior executives, but they're all using the term executive presence.
Right. And you've been working now you're like one of the original executive coaches specializing in communication. There's a lot of them out there now, but as the young people say, you are one of the OG, the original gangster executive coaches.
That's right.
So you've been observing Fortune 500 CEOs for decades, very C-suite executives. You've been around people with executive presence. Some people call it pizzazz. Some people call it flair. Some people call it charisma these days. That's a big word today, charisma. The through line through all this is it's executive presence. So in terms of that phrase, executive presence, what does that mean to you in everyday language?
Well, it actually started with the second of 5 qualities of credibility and leadership, which has always been called composure. So when I first started hearing the word executive presence, it just took me back to all of the early research on what was called executive composure. Composure, like composed, not all over the place, implies some kind of control over the way people express themselves.
And then that comes across in the book as you described it. Instead of thinking of executive presence, think of it as that executive's presence in the room, how people feel their presence.
Right. One of my favorite stories is a CEO who said to me, people come into the office, senior level people, and they talk to me, and it sounds like a drum solo in a jazz club. It's all over the place. And sometimes they run up to the whiteboard and just start drawing stuff while they're talking. Can you coach them to sound more like a composition, like Mozart, where there's a beginning, middle, and an end? That is what most of people who are looking at this experience all over the place.
Right. So we see a person who's all over the place, they're lacking that composure, and we do not see that as executive presence. In contrast, you talk about control and composure in terms of how they present themselves. And you mentioned, for example, movies, The Godfather. Can you talk about more what that self-control, because when we say control, a lot of people think, oh, you mean control other people. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about their ability to stay in control of themselves and to stay composed. And you mentioned The Godfather, which I think is a great example.
Well, what happens there is there's a scene, and Marlon Brando, who plays the Godfather, does not move a muscle while another person coming to him for a favor is asking for it. So he sits generally like this.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't even nod his head. And at the end of that scene, he puts a cat down and then finally talks a little himself. And when he does that, there's an amazing amount of control there. He says something like, "You come to me asking for justice." Pause. Yet you've never invited me to your home. Pause. So that means someone exuding that same level of control in a meeting might say something like, "That's what we're here for. I want to hear more about that. Why don't we get started?" It has that kind of quality to it.
Very crisp communication, very composed presentation of themselves. They're not flailing around. They're not doing a drum solo. Interestingly, it's not a drum solo. It's composed, just like a musical
composition.
piece.
Right.
You also talk about gravitas in the book and how people often ask, hey, we want to speak with more gravitas. So what do they mean by that? And how would you coach people to have more gravitas?
Well, gravitas has become yet another word that's used to describe executive composure. Sometimes the call is, can you help develop gravitas? Well, as the word implies, there's a certain gravity to the way people express themselves. The simplest example of that is in speed. There's an example in my first book where a president says, Americans have a right to safety in and around their homes. That gravity of bringing the tone of voice down a tone as he gets to the end. That's what gravitas means. Weightiness. Now, hopefully the content itself has weightiness, but as I always tell clients, we're a songwriting team. I don't write the lyrics to the songs. So I hope that your content has gravity to it. But as far as the description of it, how you say it, it's going to be a little slower and the tones will be a little deeper.
Yeah, and many times the clients we work with have a lot to say. They have substance, but their drum solo is getting in the way of that substance being heard in a really clear and concise way. So what's your advice about Q&A? I think at the end of the chapter about executive presence, there's a piece about how to handle Q&A, because that's where a lot of this self-control and composure comes together, because those are pressurized moments for some people. So what's your advice about Q&A?
This piece of advice about Q&A is one of the ones I am most happy about. This is something that I came onto at the very beginning of my practice. All of the questions that all of us get throughout our lives are very, very similar to the questions we were asked on high school testing and college testing. And they were called true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, and essay. At least that's the way I experienced it. So I tell my clients, if you are asked a question in a meeting that is seeking a yes or a no, no matter how complex the topic is, it's still a true, false question. So if, for instance, Alex, you asked me, do you think that if we do it that way, it's going to work? And I have all of these complex thoughts in my mind, I still have to say to myself, it's a true, false, or yes, no question. In other words, you could have sent me an email that said, Alan, you think this is going to work, true or false, circle T or F, right? I think some people probably ought to do that. And multiple choice questions have options. So I'm telling my clients, when you hear the options, just say to yourself, is it A, B, or C? You're lucky that they gave you options when they asked the question. And then there's fill in the blank questions, which are always the ones where you may not know the answer. How much did we spend 3 quarters ago? How much do you think we'll spend on the same thing next year? When do you think you'll have it? All those questions are fill in the blank. And then finally, there are essay questions, which are what we've always come to call open-ended questions. They all start with why and how. So I think that's how my clients, how all of us ought to think about handling Q&A. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes complete sense. And, I've heard this from you before because I used to work with you. And this is brilliant because so many people don't do this. You ask them a very bottom line question and they give you the essay answer instead of giving you the yes, no, or the fill in the blank or the multiple choice. So you can distinguish yourself simply by answering direct questions directly and not going on a tangent for every direct question. And then, of course, with essay questions, sometimes you are asked a bigger question, just stay organized. This is another thing that Alan teaches. Give them talk in bullet points, right? First, second, third. Keep your story organized. Keep it composed. This is part 1 of a 3-part series on Alan's book, How to Become a High Flyer and how you can become a leader at work. We're going to put links to his book in the description below this video. So let me pitch this first question to you, Alan. In one of the chapters, you talk about this debate, whether or not we're born leaders or we're growing into them over time. We're made, essentially. And you mentioned that the best approach is to think about this in terms of a root cause analysis. So what did you mean by that in terms of being a born leader or a made leader?
Well, you could ask yourself, am I exuding some of these qualities because I was born with them or because I observed them, let's say in my parents who were leaders? That would be asking, what is the root cause of this, of these qualities that I have? Maybe it's because my mother or my father was a politician and I was able to pick up on qualities that they had that maybe I was born with, as opposed to things that I learned in a class that I took or a book that I read.
I think that's the way to talk about this on an individual basis, not worry so much about the concept of the born, but look at us and say, well, look, I was observing this growing up and I learned from it. Or my parents are just like this. And maybe that's why I became like this. Maybe it was passed down through the DNA. And so where does that leave the average person? Let's say they don't know whether or not they're a leader or not. What can they do in terms of being a born leader or grown into a leader? What can they start to do? Like you talk about noticing and observing. Can you tell us more about that?
All of us should work to develop our powers of observation. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? Is it something that I can use myself to benefit not just myself, but everybody I work with? And I am very fond of this definition of a genius as someone who looks at what everyone in a meeting is looking at, but sees what nobody else sees, or listens to what everybody listens to at a meeting, but hears what no one else hears. And I have a little framework that I've encouraged people to use when they talk to their boss, where they say, I was in a meeting this morning. I heard such and such a person say X. My interpretation of what they said is X, and my suggestion to you is X. And I'd want that person's boss to say, wow, I'm impressed with his or her powers of observation. That is really helpful.
Yeah, I noticed this very early in life as you were giving that example. I was back in high school sitting in an auditorium somewhere else, not at our high school. And there was a speaker, some adult, a teacher or the director of the chorus or band or someone was speaking at this event to kick it off. And he was doing a great job, but I never really noticed anything about that. I just thought, okay, he's kicking off. And the person next to me, she said, he's a really great public speaker. Now, she was observing. I was watching too. I wasn't picking up on the fact that he was a great public speaker. I just was here. Okay, we're starting the event. But she noticed something that I didn't notice, even though we were both looking at the same thing. That's one of the turning points for me, noticing, hey, public speaking is a skill. Like that's what leaders are good at. And they're good at lots of different things that you can start noticing and you can start imitating, for lack of a better word, but making those skills your own over time.
Right. Like etiquette. People watching how people in London hold their knife and fork. Some people pick up on it and do it themselves. I try to, and others don't.
We wish they would sometimes.
To their everlasting regret.
So whether or not we suspect we're a born leader or we're maybe going to grow ourselves into a leader through hard work, you talk about 6 qualities with your clients and in this book and your first book as well, in terms of what we should be striving for. What are people noticing when they're thinking, oh, this person's a leader? And that list of 6 starts with competence. Could you go through the list and then we'll circle back to a couple of them?
Well, even though we're all born with different levels of IQ, let's say, there is still a way of demonstrating enhanced competence when you're talking to someone else. So if someone is in a meeting and they are very fluid and articulate on certain statistics that are a part of their work, it comes across as more competent. Speaking well, being articulate, comes across to others as more competent. So I don't want anyone who may not have a 170 IQ to feel like they can't exude pretty high levels of competence. It's very possible.
The other ones on the list are composure, character, sociability, which we'll talk about in a second, extroversion, and goodwill. Let's talk more about sociability.
Well, I call sociability by its plain word, which is likability. It's an extremely important quality to have. I know that after I finish working in an organization, if someone says, well, you worked with Alan, what was your take on it? They very often say, good guy, I liked him. I thought, well, that's wonderful. I'm going to be invited back because someone thought I was likable. I also think that after an interview, when someone who's doing the interview goes in and talks about the experience with someone else, and they say, well, what did you think of him or her? I think the most common first expression is, I like them. Let's bring them back. So I like to talk about the qualities that people see in us that make them think we are likable. So listening with head nodding and facial expression and asking questions that make a person feel like you're curious about them comes across as likable.
Yeah, there are a lot of these behaviors. And if we look at this list again, we'll put it on the screen: competence, composure, character, sociability, or likability. In other words, extroversion and goodwill. Most of these are fairly learnable. I'd like to quote Vince Lombardi, who you quote in the book: leaders aren't born, they are made. And they are made just like everything else through hard work. So if you're watching right now and you're thinking, I don't know if I'm a born leader, don't worry about that. You can absolutely work your way into it like most people have. In fact, there's been studies that Alan talks about in his book. And those studies show that 70% of the results in terms of our leadership are learned. Individuals learn those through life experience, and only 30% are connected to our genetic traits. The key takeaway is to be ready to learn and willing to learn and open to learn these leadership skills. Now, you also mentioned the importance of verbal communication skills as something that leaders need to be good at, a trait we can actually develop. So tell us more about why verbal communication skills are so important to you.
Well, there's three qualities to study when it comes to messaging or verbal communication: word choice, how sentences are put together, and a framework that those sentences fit into. So you learn, for instance, one syllable words are easier for the listener to understand than multi-syllable words. Sentences, which Winston Churchill described as subject, verb, object, period. And frameworks, a framework like what's always been called the 30-second elevator ride: problem, cause, consequence, solution. So mastering those three things, words, sentences, and frameworks, is what makes up verbal communication skills. To have someone else say, good talker, I like listening to her.
Yeah, and those are all very learnable. That's why we teach public speaking. That's why we teach writing skills, which are essentially the same skills, except on paper. And they will almost instantly help people come across as more leader-like. You also mentioned asking good questions and how you say that is often viewed by others as a leadership quality in the workplace. So why do you see asking good questions in that light?
Well, I've always been taken with the notion that asking, let's say, yes or no questions is closed ended and doesn't bring someone else out, which I have issues with. But when it comes to the asking, that's where I think these open ended questions may be more important. So if a person in a meeting says to everyone else, let's spend some time figuring out why they are ordering less than they used to, or let's ask ourselves how we might do a better job of getting our message out there, that is probably a more useful question to ask than, when do you expect to see this happen? Some prediction of the future. And I'm very taken with how detectives learn to be better detectives, what makes them detect things. And I think it's because they ask questions and start with why and how.
Yeah, and also leads the rest of the conversation. A very short question, close-ended question, is not going to lead the discussion in any particular direction, but a why or a how question, people will respond to that for quite a while, and it'll change their focus, change their line of thinking quite a bit. So I can see why that would be for anybody out there who wants to become a leader to start practicing asking good questions in a meeting. Let's say ask one good question per meeting just to get started.
I'm going to find out if at the Los Angeles Police Academy, where they teach skills about detecting, if I could sit in on one. I would love to do that so that I could learn some of the same things they're teaching detectives about asking the right questions at a crime scene.
And that really goes right back to what we said earlier about observing. You would be there observing the types of questions they ask in terms of, are they open-ended and how are they leading the conversation through those questions?
I think they say things to each other like, we're not asking the right question. And I thought to myself, well, what is the right question that they should be asking? And generally speaking, it's the ones we've always called open-ended.
We're going to start right in with this idea of influence, just to make sure we have a common understanding of it, because it means a lot of things to a lot of people, Alan. What's at the heart of influence skills? Or in other words, if a leader's job description said influence skills, absolutely necessary, what does that mean?
It means taking someone else's attitude from where it is to where you want it to be. So all of us have an attitude about so many topics that's generally somewhere on a 7-step scale between I agree and I don't agree. So if I'm talking to you and we're talking about a political candidate, if you are somewhere like a number 4 on a 7-step scale, and I want to get you closer to my attitude, which is a number 2, then if I can do that, I have influence skills. What does it take to move your attitude, in my example, from 4 to 2?
Okay, so it's really about changing people's mind at least a bit somewhere on this scale. Now, there are two sides to the coin when it comes to what we might call power and influence, and both sides of the coin are communication. So I want to start by talking about delivery. What's good delivery and why is it important to have it?
Well, there's a certain amount of enthusiasm that the listener would expect me to have about my attitude. So my delivery might be possibly a little louder, certainly a little slower, particularly a little slower. So there's research that would say the faster I talk, while it may sound youthful and enthusiastic, the slower I talk, the wiser and more thoughtful it sounds. So if we just take that one category of speed, slower, if it is in fact more thoughtful, is extremely important.
I'll go through a quick checklist here for the viewer. Volume, like you mentioned, livelier facial expressions, posture and active gestures, and figurative language and analogies and metaphors, some ways to enhance our message. But then on the other side of the coin, also communication. This coin is the same coin, communication. You talk about the quality of the content in terms of being disciplined, organized, and data driven. Tell us more about that.
I'm interested in the things that one person says to another that make the listener say, wow, I didn't know that. Something new. Well, that is data driven, usually means there's a statistic. There's a number somewhere in the sentence that makes the listener say, wow, I didn't know that. So content has to be, here's my belief, here's what I think, here's why I say that, and here's a data point to support that.
You're building a mini argument.
Right.
Instead of just using emotional urgency or merely good delivery, merely good eye contact, for example, or a confident voice, you're giving quality content by building a mini argument for the point you're making.
Right. When somebody in a meeting says, okay, does anyone have anything else to say on this? I want participants to say to themselves, I'm going to say something compelling. Main point, I think it's a good idea. Sub point, I say that because it's going to be faster. Data point, I have evidence that it's going to be 20% faster than it's been. That's worth saying when someone says, anybody have something to add?
You can hear that if people talk like this in a room full of intelligent people, it's going to move them along that influence scale.
Exactly. Now we're getting from 4 to 2.
Now, on the third side of the coin, which is a joke, of course, there's no third side down. You talk about the risks of using complex language in terms of our influence. So what's the downside of using what people might call vocabulary words or jargon?
Well, it takes more time for the listener to process what they've heard. They're saying to themselves, what exactly am I hearing here? You know where this happens, Alex, so often is on PowerPoint slides. Somebody else sometimes is putting the slide together, or my client is, in the example, is putting the slide together, and they have a habit of using 2 and 3 syllable versions of what otherwise would be 1 syllable words. So all of a sudden, you'll see a word like functional appear in a slide or express, like this isn't appropriately functional. And the listener has to say to themselves, wait, what exactly does that mean? When it could have been, this is not going to work. It's not the right way to do it, which, as you hear it, are all 1 syllable words. I have often said to people, I have never said to my wife, let me provide you with the information that you'll need. If she says to me, how do I get to Newhall? I don't say, let me provide you. But it happens at work all the time.
Let's pretend we're in a public speaking situation. You're going to lose a percentage of the audience for every word like that you use, every jargon or vocabulary word. We think it makes us sound smart. Maybe we do it because we're trying to impress people, but it usually has the opposite effect. And then we lose influence instead of gain it. If you want to have influence, you got to speak in a language that everybody understands. I've been preaching that on my channel for a long time.
One of my favorites is the word moribund. If someone said, we used to do it this way, and it was very good, it worked, but it's been moribund. Now, listeners saying, moribund? What's moribund? Well, moribund means it's been dead for a while. We could bring it back to life. And wouldn't that be more interesting? This is something that we can breathe life into. Is so much better than it's been moribund.
That's a great example. Very few people will follow along with moribund, but breathe life back into is something everybody will be able to follow.
Right.
So if we want to have more influence, you talk about the importance of storytelling. So what are some tips that you would give us if we want to become better storytellers?
Okay, so there's two things about storytelling, and one of them is, I think, really fascinating. And that is that all children's stories begin with once upon a time. And as soon as a child hears that, they know a story's about to come. Well, for adults, the adult version of once upon a time is something like about a month ago. So if Alex says to Alan, can you talk to the group about how this whole thing developed? I start a story with the words like, well, about a month ago, Jack was talking to Jill about this topic. Jack said X, Jill said Y, and that conversation leads us to where we are today. So storytelling, that's one tip, usually starts by taking people into the past with words like about a month ago. I think the listener automatically says, oh, good, I'm about to hear something interesting, right? The other aspect of storytelling is getting very familiar with the framework to express an idea. Frameworks mean, as an example, do I go from main point to subpoint to data point? Do I go from data point to subpoint to main point? Do I use the elevator ride of problem, cause, consequence, solution? So if Alex says to Alan, why don't you tell the group how this came about? I tell myself, I'm going to say something like, well, the problem has been that the customers are unhappy with what we've sent them. The reason is it's too complex for them to put together. The risk we run if we don't fix it is they're going to find another vendor to supply them with it. My suggestion is that we spend some time putting together an alternative and send it to them. That's a story. Problem, cause, consequence, solution. I might say, by the way, that in the category of keeping your eyes and ears open for what's going on, most TV commercials, especially in pharmaceuticals, the story is told is problem, cause, consequence, solution. So I always say to my clients, just watch that and say to yourself, if they can tell a story about a drug in 30 seconds, why can't I?
Yeah, that's a great example. I actually use pharmaceutical examples as well for when I talk about the taking people on a persuasive journey because they do it so well.
Right.
You know, it's incredible. And I say, listen, you got to be ethical, right? We're not suggesting you exaggerate the benefits here or downplay the risks. Advertisers use this for a reason. It's very, very persuasive. And if you talk like this, it's going to be much more influential than if you just think off the top of your head or you talk as you think out loud. You need a clear framework. Frameworks are really persuasive. You combine that with clear language. And of course, back in the day, you taught me the value of the frameworks when I was interning with you and then employed by you. Really sold me on that. So we'll make sure to keep passing on the word. And if you want to hear more about Alan's book, of course, you can go get it on Amazon. It's called the Highflier Handbook and it's available now. You can take a look yourself. I'll put links in the description below this video. So this is the end of a 3-part series of conversations and how people can become leaders at work. Thank you so much, Alan, for hanging out with me and my subscribers.
It's been a pleasure.